Hi there, and welcome to this lecture on Student Engagement and Learning Needs, Topic 3. This session is going to look at some of the problems we encounter as teachers in trying to inspire and maintain students' engagement with our discipline. We'll look at issues of teaching and learning style, and also of session planning, asking how we can identify and respond to student needs as teachers. So by the end of the session, I'm hoping that you'll be able to firstly, identify likely student needs in a given learning situation. Secondly, to analyse how teachers can respond to those needs in order to maintain student engagement. And thirdly, to evaluate the utility of different learning styles and teaching theories in responding to these identified student needs. So what do we mean by learning needs? It's quite simple really. We mean what students need in order to learn. Now there are quite a lot of things that can influence student learning needs, including us, and they're not always under our control. So sometimes students will have learning needs that we just can't fulfill as teachers. Nevertheless, there are some things that we can predict will influence what students need to learn. Things like cultural background will often affect the way that students engage with the subject. Disability will give a lot of students specific additional learning needs. Student skill level will also give them needs. Some students might be very skilled in one area of your subject already, but they might need bringing up to scratch in another area. I know that mathematics skills are a particular problem for a lot of scientific subjects, for instance. Previous experience will be a really big influence, especially at university, where not all students are coming straight from school. So quite a lot of students will have experience of work and experience of life in general that they'll bring to your course. What is being taught? So different subjects will obviously engender different needs in students, but also different areas in different subjects. Some areas may be very theoretical, and so students might have the need to have a lot of theories explained, and some areas might be practical, so there might be a need for a lot of demonstration in that area. When and where this lesson takes place is a really big factor in student needs. If you've ever taught a 9 AM on Monday session, perhaps when the weather's rainy and cold, in a stuffy room, you'll know what I mean. Students are affected by their environment because they're human and so are we. So if we can look to the environment, look to the time of the session, we can actually identify quite a few student needs. And finally, the intellectual and professional context. So if students are embarking on a medical degree, which has a very specific professional context, they're all thinking of becoming doctors, they'll have different student needs to, say, students embarking on an English degree, which leads to a lot of different careers, so they don't have kind of a set professional context. And those are just a few of the influences that can possibly affect students' learning needs. So now we're going to look at a couple of different learning styles. Learning styles refer to the idea that different people learn better when they receive information in particular ways. So there are quite a few theories around learning styles, where theorists have claimed to identify particular styles of learning, essentially, which are kind of ways in which they think students learn. And for a good review on kind of whether this mode of theorizing is actually worthwhile, see Kozhevnikov et al. 2014, which is a really useful review and has quite a lot of good literature in it. And that's available in a PDF format on your QM Plus module page, and you'll be able to see it after this lecture. One of the most common learning styles is known as VARK, which stands for Visual, Auditory, Read, Write, or Kinetic. And that was invented by Neil Fleming. Not in 2014, but that's the latest update. Fleming claims that there are certain people who are visual learners or auditory learners or kinesthetic learners or reading and writing learners, and that these people learn better when information is presented in their preferred way. So a visual learner will learn better from looking at the diagram on this slide, but an auditory learner will be learning from my voice because they'll be learning from what they hear. A read and write learner will be reading the slide more than listening to my words. And a kinesthetic learner might be taking notes or doing some other tactile activity to keep themselves interested. Another common learning style is known as experiential learning. This was developed by David Kolb, an educational psychologist. And according to Kolb, the model on the right-hand side shows that there are different stages of learning from experience. It's not just a matter of having the experience and then learning from it. The best learning and teaching will incorporate all 4 of the stages, which are shown in blue. So the best learning will have you doing things, thinking about how you feel things, watching things, and thinking about things. But Kolb thought that people tended to fall into one of the 4 quadrants shown in yellow. So you might be an activist and you prefer to kind of think about things than do things. You might be a pragmatist, so you prefer to theorize and do things. You might be a reflector, so you prefer to kind of feel things and watch things. Or you might be a theorist, so you tend to think and watch, but not necessarily to do. Some subjects tend to make much more use of one stage in particular than others, because some subjects are more theoretical than others, and I think that particularly applies to sort of subsets of a discipline. So, for instance, theoretical physics might have less of the doing than experimental physics. However, in most subjects you get the doing as well as the feeling, the watching and the thinking. So there's always scope for including all 4 aspects of the cycle in your teaching. So the existence of learning styles is obviously very useful for thinking about the different ways in which people might learn, but that still leaves the question of, can it help us to meet learning needs? And fundamentally, it's just impossible to identify what students' learning styles are. It might be possible if you have 4 or 5 students in a classroom to identify, oh, this person is a really visual learner, this person is a really auditory learner, because they always listen to everything but they don't necessarily look at the diagrams. But if you've got classes of 200 or even say 15 or 20, it would just be a massive waste of time to try and identify each student's preferred learning style and then try to teach to it. But there is a possibility that we can use learning styles theory to inform how we teach in a different way. Because these learning style theorists have looked at the different ways in which information can be presented, we can use that to make sure that we present our information in different ways, perhaps presenting information in different ways at the same time. So I've got these slides with diagrams, with text that you can read, so hopefully attracting both read and write and visual learners, but I'm also reading out the words. I've got an audio aspect, so in that way it's aimed to kind of encourage people who are visual learners and people who are auditory learners. But you can also use it to allow students to experience things in different ways. So for the experiential learning, you can give students time for planning, time for acting, time for observing, and time for reflection. So it means you just leave space for them to do all 4 activities. And that doesn't require you to make sure that students prefer thinking or they prefer reflecting. It just means that you leave space so that people can take more time on the activities that they're better at and that they need. So learning styles can help us meet learning needs, but there are also some more practical tools that you can use. Presentation and teaching style is a huge one here. So think about the content that you're going to be teaching and the different ways that you might present it. This is the other place that learning styles can be useful. Some material actually just works better in being presented in a visual style or an auditory style, and so that's not the style of the learner necessarily, but it just refers to a style of presenting information. And that's something that really comes out in the 2014 review, if you choose to read it. So if you're teaching statistics, you might want to use a lot of diagrams to show how statistics can be visualized on the page. But you might want to use a more kinesthetic style if you're teaching a practical skill, because you want students to be able to practice actually doing something, not just kind of watching you do something. You can also use lesson planning as a tool to try and meet learning needs. If you've identified students' learning needs from the influences I talked about in the first slide, you can plan your lesson in response to them. So if you're teaching late in the day and you know that students are going to be tired, students might need a break where they wouldn't normally, and you can plan for that. If you know you've got a student with dyslexia, for example, you could give them extra time for reading or the chance to listen to a passage rather than just reading it off the screen. there are also issues like if you have a lot of students who are culturally not very experienced with group work, you can plan your lessons so that they are introduced to group work gradually. So lesson planning is a really important space where you can sit and think about the needs of your students and what needs your material might be kind of bringing to those students as well, and kind of build that into the plan. Evaluation is also a tool for meeting learning needs on the other side of the lesson. So sometimes we can sort of sense that students have a need that we're not meeting. We can sense that they're not responding to what we're doing, but it's really hard to tell why or what we could do about it. So collecting mid-course evaluation, perhaps through post-it notes, where you just give the students a post-it note, tell them to write down something they like or something they don't like about the course, and then collect them in anonymously, or using an online poll, or just even asking students if they're not afraid to talk in front of you. This can give really vital information on what the students' needs are that you can then use in planning the next session. So it's not a case of, oh, I've done these 3 things, it's, I've evaluated, and now I can go back to my lesson planning and I can go back to my teaching style with this new information I have about the student needs. So that's information about learning needs, but there's also this funny term I've used in the title, student engagement. One of the definitions I like the most is this one from the Educational Glossary. In education, student engagement refers to the degree of attention, curiosity, interest, optimism and passion that students show when they're learning or being taught, which extends to the level of motivation they have to learn and progress in their education. Generally speaking, the concept of student engagement is predicated on the belief that learning improves when students are inquisitive, interested or inspired, and that learning tends to suffer when students are bored, dispassionate, disaffected, or otherwise disengaged. So far, so obvious. But student engagement as a phrase could have 2 possible meanings. One, it could be that we are engaging the students, engagement of students, or it could mean that students are engaging themselves, engagement by students. And I'd like to offer a midpoint between these 2. So students ultimately responsible for engaging themselves. I can't make a student engage if they don't want to. But we as teachers can encourage and help them. And in fact, you might argue that we have a responsibility to help them engage as much as we can. There are 3 dimensions of engagement that have been identified by Vicky Trowler in a literature review from 2010, which is also on QM+. And actually that review is really useful because it has a lot of literature around student engagement and the different ways that it's been used in educational research. But the first of the 3 dimensions is behavioural engagement. So this is where students comply with ground rules and behavioural norms and don't behave disruptively. So this isn't just being obedient, this is students being in the class and wanting to learn and knowing that in order to get the best out of the class that they can, they need to sit down, they need to stop talking when you're talking, they need to do what you tell them to, they need to prepare for the lesson, simple things like that. And often this is seen as an issue of discipline. But when students are disengaged, it's important to ask, well, why are they disengaged? Why are they more interested in talking to their friends on Facebook than they are in listening to my lecture? So behavioural engagement, when students aren't talking to their friends on Facebook, they are listening to a lecture, is a real sign that students are kind of engaged with the lesson, they're invested in it and they want to learn more. Emotional engagement is the second dimension, and this is where students experience positive reactions, such as enjoyment, interest, or a sense of belonging. So students are interested in the course, they feel safe there, and they're actually enjoying the learning, which is obviously a really great thing, and that tends to lead to other forms of engagement as well. The final dimension, but maybe one of the most important, is cognitive engagement, in which students are invested in their learning, they seek to go beyond the stated reactions, and they enjoy a challenge. So they don't just turn up and do the reading because you tell them to. They're personally invested in their learning. They want to do well for the sake of learning because they're interested in what you're teaching them. They seek to go beyond what you ask them to, and they enjoy a challenge. So when they don't just do the minimum that you tell them to, they want to challenge themselves. All these kind of things I think you'll recognise as being part of an engaged student's behaviour, but it's good to see them separated out into those 3 dimensions. So, are your students engaged? Just stop now and take a minute to write down some possible signs that students are engaged. It could be examples of behaviour that you've seen in your own students, or just what you think an engaged student might look like to a teacher. And now I'm going to shut up for 30 seconds, so you've got time to write that down. Okay, did you get a couple of signs down? Good. A couple of signs that I think make me think that a student are engaged are things like taking notes willingly, bringing a notebook to the session. It can sound like a bare minimum, but some students don't do it. Deliberately sitting at the front or sitting at the back with their friends, but still looking at you when you're talking. They might be on their laptops if they're taking notes, and some students, when they are engaged, will still be on the internet, but they might be Googling something that's related to the topic, or they might even be tweeting about how much they're enjoying what you're teaching. Engaged students tend to be smiling, they tend to make eye contact, they don't tend to arrive very late to the class if they can help it, they tend to bring everything they need, and they tend to be prepared and to have thought about things. So they haven't just kind of done the reading, they've actually thought about the reading and they've got things to say in class. Now, we're going to have a slightly more negative exercise, but along the same lines. Think about what a disengaged student would look like. Have you experienced any of those? I know I have. Just take another 30 seconds to write down some examples of behaviour that you might expect or that you've seen from disengaged students. Okay, I got lots of examples writing these down. I'm sure you did too. Sadly, sometimes there can be more examples of disengagement than engagement. A couple of mine include talking while you're talking because they're just not interested in what you're saying. You can tell if they're online and disengaged because they tend to keep typing. Even when you kind of tell everyone to stop, look at the front and think about what you're saying for a moment, these students aren't listening, so they just keep on typing messages to their friends or whatever. Disengaged students tend to look bored. Sometimes they might actually sort of close their eyes and doze off, or they might be talking about something else. So when you have, for instance, students have to turn to their partner or discuss in small groups, you can often hear some students just clearly disengaged, talking about what was on TV last night, or sometimes struggling to talk at all if they're in a small group and the rest of the group is prepared and engaged. You can spot the disengaged student because they're not joining in the conversation, because they don't feel like they've got anything to contribute. So there are lots of different tools that you can use in lesson planning to ensure student engagement. One of them is delivery, that's key. Just having a variety of activities is really important. Are the students just sitting listening to you and taking notes for an hour? Because if so, that requires a huge amount of concentration on their part, and that can often lead to very quick disengagement. Data suggests that students' performance in lectures falls off dramatically after the first 15 minutes. So they can stay awake and take notes for 15 minutes, but then that's it, they're done. But if you introduce a break every 15 minutes, their activity will go back up because you'll wake them up again, basically. So it's important to notice whether you're giving students a break, a bit of variety in there to keep it interesting. Content, also really important. Obviously you can't change the content and just say, oh, this isn't very engaging, so I'm just not going to teach you this really important theory. But if you know that content is particularly difficult, you can introduce mechanisms to check understanding, maybe a bit of light relief if the content's particularly heavy, or maybe start simple to give the students a bit of confidence before you build up to the really difficult stuff. Environment, again, really important for engagement. You might have a stuffy, hot, sleepy lecture room. You might be teaching at a low energy time of day. There are lots of different things that can affect your students, but just be aware if you find that you've got a lot of disengaged students in your class and nothing you do seems to be working, it might be environmental. And it could just be that there's nothing you can do about that. You know, we all have to teach in horrible rooms. Sometimes it's as simple as opening a window or giving students a break, or even just acknowledging, yeah, this is a really stuffy lecture room. Let me know when you need a break. You know, come 5 minutes later, but go and get yourself a coffee first. Things like that. But this is one of the ones that sometimes you just can't control. So you do as much as you can, and then if they're still not engaged because of a horrible room, that may not be your fault. There may also be individual needs that affect engagement. Students might have particular needs such as cultural issues or disability issues that affect both how they are able to actually engage and how engaged they're able to look. So sometimes students might be culturally conditioned to not speak up in class and not ask questions. So it might seem that they're not engaged, but actually they are engaging, just in a different way. But also students just have a lot going on in their lives, like everybody. So if a student is disengaged one week, it could be that it's not your fault. There's just a lot of other stuff going on in their life. And it's still their responsibility to get back on track, of course. And it's absolutely within your rights to ask them to re-engage for the lesson, but you can't always control individual levels of engagement. Teaching methods also key for engagement. And one of the most important aspects of your teaching methods is how interactive your teaching is. So even in a lecture setting where you can't necessarily have a cross-class discussion, you can maybe ask for informal feedback, so ask a question and then invite people to shout answers back at you. This will really only work for one-word answers, obviously. You can take a vote using clickers or audience response systems if you have them, or just a hands up if you don't, so put your hand up if you agree, or put your hand up if you disagree, and then you can kind of generally see which side the audience is on, and that just makes them feel like they're being involved in the lecture. You can get students to feedback after a group or pair exercise, so take 60 seconds, talk to your neighbour, and even where, again, the group is too big for them to feedback, you can just say, take 60 seconds, talk to your neighbour about something, and then turn and face me again. And you don't really need to hear them feedback, because they've been interacting with someone else. That's almost as good as interacting with you. You can also build in a fun or active element. So if you've got a small class, you can get them to draw on the whiteboard, or you can get them to find an answer online to a puzzle, or get them to maybe do some tweets or create a BuzzFeed article, silly things like that, things that I use to try and get my students a bit pepped up and getting them happy to interact with each other and interact with me. You can also check engagement with students. You can build in things in your teaching methods. So you can ask a question, see how people answer. You can stop and ask everyone how they're feeling. So you can say, are you up for a challenge, or are you completely lost? Hands up if you're one, or hands up if you're the other, and just kind of directly asking, are you engaged? Because students can be surprisingly willing to say, oh, I'm not engaged, and here's what I need for me to be engaged, and that's really useful. And even in a large class, you can get them to put their hands up if they understand, put their hands up if they don't understand, and that doesn't mean you then need to answer their questions individually, but it could just mean you need to go back a slide and explain something, or maybe bring an explanation to the next class, so even if you don't have time to explain something in more detail at that moment because it would ruin your plan, you can take that away and maybe explain it in some other way. It's also important to create an inclusive atmosphere with your teaching methods to make students engaged, and this is especially important for emotional engagement. So for shy students, or for students who culturally aren't used to speaking in front of the large group, small group work is less challenging, and it can be a great way for them to build up to speaking in front of the whole class by being able to speak to 3 or 4 people. And that's a useful way to check engagement if you think someone's being quiet, because if they're quiet but just a bit shy, they may well respond in the small group, and then you can see that they do have something to say, just they're too scared to say it to the whole class. Never ever mock students. I can't stress this enough. It doesn't matter how stupid you think a question is or how stupid you think a mistake is. Never do it. It's not worth it, because then you instantly lose the trust of the student. I find if someone makes a mistake that is humorous, so if they make a humorous misspelling, I will accept that the rest of the class is laughing, but I'll also then make a point of saying that I made a similar mistake and getting them to laugh at me, so the student doesn't feel ashamed, so there's not an atmosphere of kind of shame and mockery in your classroom. And if you think you'll need them, perhaps if you have a rowdy class or a particularly contentious topic, establish ground rules. And this can be useful to do in concert with all the students. And then you've established not what you want the class to do, but what the class want as a whole to do. So then when you need to discipline someone or tell them off, you can refer back to the rules of the whole class, so they're not just disobeying you, they're actually disobeying what their friends want to do, and they're making it harder for their friends to learn. So that's another way of creating an inclusive atmosphere while still maintaining discipline and respect. Interaction with students, really important for all the kinds of engagement. So just keep a line of open communication and be as approachable as possible. Making eye contact with students, even in a lecture, I tend to make eye contact with as many students as possible, shows that you're speaking to students, not speaking at them. And it kind of helps maintain their attention, because they know that you will know if they're asleep. Body language, really important. Just think for a minute about what you look like when you're teaching and what your body language shows to students. Do you always sit behind a desk? Do you sit in front of the students and have the students in rows? Or do you sit with them in a circle? What's that relationship like? Humour is useful, but have a light touch. Obviously, don't mock students. Be able to laugh at yourself, or maybe have a fun fact or two up your sleeve that can make you seem more approachable if you don't seem like you're taking the subject incredibly seriously. That can be really useful. Although obviously you take knowledge seriously as a teacher. Tone of voice is really important. Do you speak clearly, or do you lecture in a monotone? This is something that a surprising number of people do, and it's not their fault, because most academics aren't trained to speak. But it's just a good idea to pay attention to these kinds of things. Attitude is really important, and this will depend on your style as a teacher. So personally, I tend to be quite lax. I don't enforce harsh rules or ban people from the classroom if they're late. And your style might be completely the opposite. You might like to make rules and stick to them, which is absolutely fine. Choose the attitude that suits you, but remember, if you enforce really harsh rules, A, you'll have to live with maybe being less approachable to the students, and B, you've got to stick to them. So if you say, you can't come into my classroom if you're more than 5 minutes late, that has to mean that nobody can come into the classroom if they're more than 5 minutes late, even if they're your favourite student. And it also means that you need to stick to the same rules. So you can't be 20 minutes late. You have to show that you're subject to the same rules as them. And that is the end of the lecture. So thanks very much for your time. Now please have a look at the rest of the resources on QM+. And reflect on the questions that are asked on the QM Plus page to get ready for the Blackboard Collaborate discussion or for your seminar discussion. And thanks very much for listening.